So what if I told you that one of the most famous historical epics ever written, a story full of massive physical plagues, rivers turning to blood, swarms of locusts, the parting of a literal sea. What if none of that was actually meant to be read as a map of the ancient world at all?
Right.
Like what if instead it was meant to be an autopsy of your own ego?
It completely depends how we usually interact with history, doesn't it? Or
Yeah.
just ancient literature in general. I mean, we are so conditioned to look for
Oh,
geography. I
absolutely.
want to find, the exact beach where a historical figure stood. Or we
Yeah.
want to dig up the chariot wheels in the sand to prove, without a doubt, that a story happened exactly as it was written.
Yeah, we want the grand epics to be measurable. Like, we want them out there in the real world, neatly categorized in the past. But today, we are taking this incredibly familiar story, the Exodus, Pharaoh, Moses, the plagues of Egypt, and we're looking at a really radical, deeply internal reinterpretation of it.
We really are.
So, welcome to the deep dive. The text we are unpacking today has absolutely shattered my preconceived notions of, how to even read this kind of literature.
The lens we're using is just a remarkable piece of work. We are pulling from a single source today, a text called The Inner Path Through Exodus. And this focuses on the interpretations of a woman named Madame Guyon.
Right.
Specifically, we're going to look at how she views chapters 7, 8, 10, and 11 of the Exodus narrative. And to truly appreciate what she's doing here, it really helps to understand who is doing the talking.
Yeah, give us a little context on her.
So Madame Guyon was a 17th century French mystic, and she lived in a time of intense religious and political rigidity.
Which is putting it mildly, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And her writings about finding an internal, unshakable connection to the divine actually got her imprisoned in the Bastille for years.
Wow, which adds this incredible, I don't know, a layer of gravity to her work. Here is a woman locked inside a literal stone dungeon, writing about how to achieve ultimate, untouchable internal freedom.
Yeah, the irony there is profound.
It really is. And her method for doing that is to take the physical plagues of Egypt and turn them into an intricate psychological and spiritual allegory. So our mission for this deep dive is to map out this inner path.
Right, because we aren't looking for archaeological evidence today.
No, not at all. We are exploring how this text transforms physical events into a really profound commentary on human psychology, the nature of truth, and what happens when our pride violently clashes with reality.
And this framework is going to grip you, the listener, regardless of your background. Even if you have never opened a religious text in your life, you have definitely experienced the dynamics she describes here.
Oh, totally.
You know exactly what it feels like to have your pride cornered by an undeniable fact.
Mhm.
The exhaustion of trying to maintain a facade. Guyon is basically asking us to examine how we distinguish what we think is true light from the sheer illusion of our own intelligence.
Yeah, and to even step foot on this inner path, the text establishes a prerequisite for the traveler. And honestly, it is an extreme prerequisite.
It asks a lot.
It really does. So we start with chapter 7 of the narrative, where Moses and Aaron are standing before the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. This is the inciting incident of the entire conflict, right?
Right. And Guyon points to a very specific phrase in Exodus 7.1. In the text, God tells Moses, "I have made you like God to Pharaoh."
Okay.
Now, a conventional literal reading of that line usually interprets it as an assertion of power. It's seen as a divine mandate, giving Moses the authority to command a king.
Like a structural hierarchy thing?
Exactly. But Guyon takes this in a radically different, entirely internal direction. She argues that this phrase actually represents individuals who have become entirely dead to self.
Dead to self. That is a heavy, almost unsettling phrase. When we hear that in a modern context, it almost sounds nihilistic. What is the text actually describing here?
Guyon uses very precise phrasing to unpack this. She says that for these individuals, their created nature has completely disappeared.
Created nature.
Yeah, and to understand that, we have to define what she means by the self or the created nature. She is talking about the human ego in its totality.
Okay, so like all of it.
All of it. She means there are no personal desires left, no defensiveness, no ambition, no need for a legacy, no instinct for self-preservation, no desire to be liked. Everything that constructs the I or the me as we experience it on a daily basis has been completely annihilated.
Wow.
And what is left in that empty space is only the divine presence.
So it's not just about being a nice person, because we throw around words like selflessness all the time.
We do, yeah.
We say someone is selfless because they let someone else take the credit at work, or they spend their weekends volunteering. But we usually view that as a behavioral trait, right? Like a personality quirk.
It's a crucial distinction to make here. What Guyon is talking about is not a behavioral adjustment. It's an ontological shift.
Ontological, meaning like the study of being.
Right. What you fundamentally are. Let's say you have a colleague at the office who brings in donuts every Friday. That's a nice, seemingly selfless behavior, right?
Sure.
But if that colleague gets secretly resentful when no one thanks them, or if they bring the donuts specifically to build political capital with the boss, then the ego is still completely in the driver's seat.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
The behavior looks selfless, but the ontology, the core state of being, is entirely self-serving.
The ego is just wearing a nicer outfit.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The ego loves to play the martyr if it gets applause for it. Guyon's concept of being dead to self means the total eradication of that underlying mechanism entirely.
It's hard to even picture that.
It is. Imagine existing without a single trace of self-interest, coloring your perception of the world. You have no reputation to protect, so you never feel anxious about what people say behind your back.
Yeah.
You have no pride to be wounded, so you never get defensive. You don't get offended because there is literally no you left to take offense. Guyon claims that when a person reaches this absolute zero of the ego, they become like God to the kings of the world, simply because they are no longer operating on the world's terms.
They're playing a completely different game.
Exactly. They are entirely unshakable because there's nothing left to shake. You cannot threaten a person who doesn't care if they live or die, succeed or fail in the eyes of society.
I was trying to conceptualize this while reading, and the best analogy I could come up with is a pane of glass.
Okay, I like that.
So imagine your mind, your consciousness is a pane of glass. When we look out at the world, our ego is like dirt and thick, greasy smudges all over that glass.
Yeah.
Our anxieties, our need to be right, our political biases, our insecurities, all of that is grime.
Right, it distorts the view.
Exactly. It distorts what we see. We don't see reality. We see reality filtered through our insecurities. And because the glass is dirty, it casts its own dark shadow. But Guyon is saying that to walk the true inner path, you have to become a perfectly clean, flawless, invisible pane of glass.
Because there's no self to block the light.
Right. Because there is no self, no dirt, no smudges, no ego to defend. You don't cast your own shadow anymore. You just perfectly transmit whatever light is on the other side of you.
That's a great way to put it. The glass doesn't generate the light and doesn't color the light. It just allows it to pass through entirely unobstructed.
Yeah.
And this concept actually explains another curious detail in the text regarding the role of the prophet or the interpreter. Guyon points out that in the narrative, Aaron is described purely as an interpreter for Moses. Moses is the one who is dead to self, but Aaron is the one who actually speaks to Pharaoh.
So Aaron is essentially the spokesperson in this dynamic.
Right. But Guyon has a very specific, almost restrictive view of what these prophets or interpreters are. According to her framework, true spiritual interpreters possess no original message of their own.
None at all.
None. Their entire function is solely to transmit the words of those who have achieved that ego-dead state. They are not supposed to add their own spin, their own charisma, or their own theological hot takes to the message.
So, following the glass analogy, if the ego-dead person is the pure glass pane transmitting the light, the interpreter is just the wooden frame holding the glass up so the rest of the room can see it.
Exactly.
The frame doesn't add to the light, it just facilitates the viewing.
And it requires immense humility to just be the frame, But this setup is absolutely essential because once this pure ego-dead truth enters the world, it doesn't just sit there peacefully.
Right, it causes a reaction.
It is immediately and violently challenged by the existing power structures.
Which brings us to the first major confrontation on the inner path.
Yeah, this is Exodus 7.12. It's one of the most cinematic moments in the story. Moses and Aaron are in the throne room. Aaron throws down his staff, and it transforms into a snake. It's this undeniable demonstration of divine reality.
But Pharaoh isn't impressed.
No, not at all. He calls in his own magicians, and they throw down their staffs, and through their secret arts, their staffs turn into snakes too. For a moment, it looks like a complete stalemate. The divine truth produced a snake, but the worldly system produced the exact same thing. Right?
But then Aaron's snake attacks and literally swallows up all the magician's snakes.
Guyon breaks this down brilliantly as an allegory for ideological warfare. She says the opposing magicians represent those who hold wrong and evil teachings.
Okay.
But here is the critical insight she offers. They don't show up dressed as villains.
They never do.
No, they masquerade as spiritual people or as arbiters of truth. They use tricks, sleight of hand, and highly sophisticated rhetoric to mimic the genuine article. They know exactly how to speak the language of truth without actually possessing any of it.
Hold on, though, because if I am a regular person standing in Pharaoh's court and I see two different groups of people throw down staffs and both staffs turn into live, slithering snakes, how am I supposed to know which one is the divine truth and which one is the parlor trick?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because visually, they are identical. Both sides look powerful. And, I mean, in our modern world, this happens constantly. You have two talking heads on television, both citing data, both sounding incredibly confident, both claiming they have the absolute truth. How do we know what's real when the mimicry is that good?
It is the essential question of discernment in an age of information, honestly. And Guyon provides a fascinating, highly active answer to this. The defining characteristic of divine truth, according to her interpretation, is not just that it exists alongside falsehood.
Okay.
It doesn't just present a better argument and then wait for the audience to vote on who won. The defining characteristic of truth is that it actively swallows everything else.
It consumes the lie.
Yes. Guyon argues that the spirit of truth intrinsically exposes and consumes the false facade because truth and lies cannot actually coexist in a state of equilibrium.
Right.
The magicians can mimic the form. They can make something that looks exactly like a snake, but they do not have the underlying substance, the actual reality. Their snakes are illusions sustained entirely by effort and trickery.
Ah, I see.
So when genuine ego-dead truth encounters mimicry, the mimicry simply cannot sustain its own weight in the presence of reality. It is swallowed whole. It is absorbed, neutralized, and erased.
It's like truth is a black hole for lies. The lies just get pulled across the event horizon and crushed by the sheer gravitational weight of what is real. You don't have to debate a parlor trick, you just expose it to the crushing pressure of reality, and the trick collapses on itself.
That is the exact mechanism she is describing. The complete victory of truth over the illusion sets off a profound psychological chain reaction. Because if we follow the logic, you would assume that once someone's lies are completely swallowed by undeniable truth, the conflict would just end.
Right, you would think the magicians and Pharaoh would look at the floor, see that their snakes are gone and Moses' snake is still there, and just say, okay, we were wrong. You clearly possess the genuine truth. We surrender.
That would be the logical response.
But here is the terrifying part about human psychology, and where Guyon's text gets incredibly sharp. When that undeniable truth swallows the lie, the ego doesn't surrender. It doubles down.
Which pulls us directly into Chapter 8 and her brilliant exploration of the psychological parasite of conceit.
Yeah, so the narrative moves to the plague of lice. Aaron strikes the dust of the earth, and the dust turns into swarms of lice, covering humans and animals across Egypt.
It's a very visceral image.
It really is. The magicians try to use their secret arts to replicate this plague, to make their own lice, but they fail. They are completely tapped out. And they actually go to Pharaoh and openly admit defeat. They say, this is the finger of God. They confess the truth out loud.
But the reaction is surprising.
Yeah, the text points out that Pharaoh's heart remains hard. He refuses to listen.
Guyon zeroes in on this moment because it highlights one of the most profound and frustrating paradoxes of human behavior, the paradox of evidence. Her text explicitly states that when those walking the inner path reveal undeniable truths or perform acts that cannot be explained away, it does not soften the opposition. In fact, it actively hardens the hearts of their enemies.
We experience this all the time, don't we? If you prove someone wrong beyond a shadow of a doubt, if you hand them the absolute proof that their worldview is flawed, they rarely thank you for it. They usually get really angry.
Cognitive psychology actually has a term for this today. It's called the backfire effect. When a deeply held belief is contradicted by overwhelming evidence, people often strengthen their original belief rather than abandon it.
Wow, so Guyon saw this coming.
She observed this centuries ago. She points to a massive cognitive dissonance happening in the throne room. Even the most hardened, wicked people are sometimes forced by sheer reality to admit a fact. I mean, the magicians acknowledge it out loud, but Guyon draws a thick, impenetrable line between acknowledging a fact and experiencing inner transformation.
Think about a corporate executive who has championed a specific business strategy for 5 years. He has tied his entire reputation, his ego, and his identity to this strategy.
Oh, this is a perfect example.
Right. Suddenly, the market shifts, and the data comes in proving unequivocally that the strategy is failing and bankrupting the company. The executive can look at the spreadsheet, he can acknowledge the numbers are red, he can admit the fact.
But he won't change course.
Exactly. His internal posture refuses to soften. He will blame the marketing team, he will blame the economy, he will blame the customers, he will do anything but surrender his ego.
Because softening would require the one thing the ego absolutely refuses to do. It would require a kind of death. It loops right back to the prerequisite in Chapter 7.
Right, becoming dead to self.
To accept the genuine truth means you have to let your own created nature diminish. Your ego has to take a fatal blow. And the ego, as a survival mechanism, would rather be destroyed by a literal plague than voluntarily surrender its own sovereignty.
That is so dark, but so true.
It is. So when the ego is cornered by undeniable truth, its final defense mechanism isn't logic or debate. Its defense mechanism is to calcify, to turn to stone. It shuts down all receptors.
The ego would rather die than surrender. And that calcification breeds a kind of sickness in the mind, which is exactly how Guyon interprets the plague itself. She uses this deeply visceral metaphor regarding the physical plague of lice, contrasting how it affects the persecutors versus the people of God.
She reimagines this physical infestation as a deeply psychological one. Guyon writes that the persecutors, the ones whose hearts have hardened against the truth, suffer the agonizing sting of their own conceit and malice.
I want to linger on this metaphor because it is incredibly potent. We usually think of conceit or arrogance or malice as just character flaws. Like, oh, that person is so arrogant, they must really love themselves. We tend to think that arrogant people are happy, even if they are annoying to the rest of us.
But Guyon sees it differently.
She frames conceit and malice as active, biting parasites. It's the lice of conceit.
It completely flips the victim dynamic. Guyon is arguing that when you refuse the inner path, when you harden your heart to protect your pride, your own arrogance mutates into a swarm that feeds on you.
It's an infestation of your own mind. When you are constantly trying to protect your ego, constantly trying to prove you are the smartest person in the room, constantly harboring malice toward the people who expose your flaws, you cannot rest.
No, you're constantly agitated.
Your own thoughts are crawling all over you. You lie awake at 3 a.m. replaying arguments in your head, trying to win debates against people who aren't even there. You are bitten by paranoia, by anxiety, by the exhausting, relentless need to maintain your facade. You are entirely unable to find peace because your own conceit is literally eating you alive from the inside out.
And Guyon makes it very clear that this is a self-inflicted torment. The lice in the story are born from the dust of the earth, which she links to the earthly, grounded, hardened reality of the persecutors. They generated the environment that bred the parasite. Guyon then contrasts this agonizing, restless state with her description of the blessed people. She notes that those on the inner path dwell with absolute satisfaction in a place of peace, completely untouched by the plague.
And the reason they are untouched connects perfectly to the glass pane analogy we used earlier. They don't itch because they have no ego for the lice to feed on.
Exactly. Parasites need a host. If you have no self to protect, the lice of conceit have nothing to bite. The parasitic anxiety of the ego cannot touch someone who has already surrendered their ego.
That makes perfect sense.
If someone insults an ego-dead person, the insult just passes right through the clear glass. There is no pride there to be wounded, no malice generated in return, and therefore no anxiety to keep them awake at night. They are completely insulated from the psychological plague because the environment that breeds it has been totally eradicated within them.
It is a terrifyingly accurate description of how modern anxiety often operates. So much of our stress is just the maintenance cost of our own egos. So we have truth swallowing lies, and we have the ego hardening and breeding its own parasitic anxiety. But as we move into Chapter 10, Guyon takes us even deeper, doesn't she?
She does. She moves from how we feel, the itching and the anxiety, to how we fundamentally perceive reality itself.
We arrive at the plague of darkness and Guyon's profound critique of human reason. The narrative setup is stark. For 3 days, a thick, pitch-black darkness descends over Egypt.
A darkness that could be felt.
Exactly. The text says it was so dark that it could be felt and no one could even leave their spot for 3 days. It is a paralyzing, suffocating blackness. But in sharp contrast, the Israelites had light where they lived.
Guyon unpacks this with what I think is her most striking philosophical argument in the whole text.
Yeah.
She argues that this darkness isn't just a meteorological event. It isn't a solar eclipse or a massive sandstorm. She claims that this darkness is actually God placing the wicked into his truth.
Wait, let me stop right there because that sounds completely counterintuitive. We almost universally equate truth with light. In our language, we say, let me shed some light on the subject, or the light bulb went off in my head, or I finally saw the light.
Right, light is understanding.
So how can being placed directly into divine truth result in a paralyzing 3-day darkness?
It is a brilliant subversion of our expectations. Guyon asserts that the wicked, the ego-driven people have been living their entire lives illuminated by a fake light.
Oh, fake light.
Yes, they have constructed their entire worldview, their entire sense of reality, on the illusion of their own intelligence, their own logic, and their own sensory perception. That is the light they use to navigate their lives.
Okay, I'm following.
But when God suddenly exposes them to ultimate, unvarnished divine truth, that fake light is instantly overpowered and extinguished. Because these people have never developed the spiritual capacity to perceive true divine light, the experience of ultimate truth registers to their minds as absolute, terrifying darkness.
Oh, man. It's like living your entire life inside a casino in Las Vegas.
Perfect analogy.
You've got the neon lights, the flashing slot machines, the artificial glow from the ceiling. You think that is what light is. You think you can see perfectly fine. And then suddenly, someone rips you out of the casino and drops you into the middle of the Sahara Desert at high noon and forces you to stare directly at the sun.
It's overwhelming.
The sheer magnitude of the real light completely overloads your retinas. You go blind. You are paralyzed by the brightness, but to you, it just feels like pitch blackness.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And the implication Guyon draws from this is staggering. She is saying that the more intelligent and enlightened these worldly people think they are, the more they show off their fake neon lights in front of other humans, the more hopelessly ignorant and blind they actually are when confronted with genuine, transcendent reality.
So Guyon is essentially throwing the entirety of human reason under the bus.
She absolutely is. She is outlining her epistemology, which is the philosophical study of how we know what we know. Guyon states unequivocally that everything originating from human senses and reason is frequently erroneous.
Just flat out wrong.
Yes. And why? Because human beings, in their ego-driven fallen state, are fundamentally composed of vanity and lies. Our reasoning is constantly corrupted by our desire to protect ourselves. Therefore, she concludes, truth only comes from God, because God is truth.
We really need to sit with how deeply offensive that idea is to the modern mind. We live in a society that essentially worships human reason. We worship the scientific method. We worship data analytics. We trust what our eyes and ears tell us, and we believe that if we just apply enough logic to a problem, we can solve it.
We think we can figure everything out.
Right. But Guyon is explicitly dismissing our primary tools for navigating the universe. She's saying that the hardware you are using to process reality, your brain, your senses, is fundamentally corrupted by the operating system of your ego. If the hardware is corrupted, the logic software running on it is going to produce vain, self-serving outputs no matter how clever the math looks.
It's fascinating because evolutionary psychology actually echoes a secular version of this today.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, our brains did not evolve to perceive objective cosmic truth. They evolved to keep us alive on the savannah. We have confirmation bias. We have the availability heuristic. We literally see what we expect to see or what benefits our survival.
That makes a lot of sense.
Guyon recognized this underlying corruption centuries ago. She saw that as long as you rely on this corrupted hardware, you are generating a fake light. And as long as you rely on fake light, you will eventually be paralyzed when you encounter a reality that cannot be contained by your logic.
But she contrasts this terrifying, paralyzing darkness of the Egyptians with the state of the righteous, the people on the inner path. She says that those who are united to God by faith live in a true light, and this true light never dims. In fact, she says it grows increasingly brighter until it reaches noon.
But there is a massive paradox embedded here, isn't there?
Yeah, because earlier we established that walking this inner path requires you to lose yourself.
Yes, and Guyon addresses this paradox head-on with incredible poetic beauty. She acknowledges that to the outside observer, and frankly, sometimes even to the person walking the path themselves, it might frequently seem like they have lost all light entirely.
Because they've let go of their human reason.
Exactly. Because they have abandoned human reason, because they refuse to use the worldly metrics of success, power, and logic to navigate their lives, they look like they're stumbling around in the dark. They look foolish to the world. But Guyon argues that precisely in that moment of apparent darkness, when they have completely let go of their own fake light and their own understanding, that is exactly when they are illuminated by profound divine light.
The moment you feel like you've completely lost your way by the world's standards, when your logic fails you, when your plans collapse and you have no idea what to do next, that might actually be the moment you are seeing clearly for the very first time. You aren't being distracted by the neon casino lights anymore.
Exactly. And Guyon offers what she boldly calls an infallible method for living in this paradoxical state of truth.
An infallible method. That's a strong claim.
It is. She says you must completely entrust yourself to God and view everything exclusively through God's eyes, not your own.
You literally have to borrow God's vision because your own eyes are fatally compromised by vanity.
Correct. You have to relinquish the right to interpret the events of your own life.
Wow, that's hard to do.
It's incredibly hard. When something happens to you, a job loss, a breakup, a sudden illness, the human reasoning immediately asks, how does this benefit me? How does this hurt me? Whose fault is this? We analyze everything through the lens of our ego's survival.
Right, it's our default setting.
Guyon's infallible method requires you to stop doing that. You stop interpreting. You trust the divine perspective, which operates on a cosmic plane that your human reason simply cannot access. You accept that what looks like a disaster to your ego might actually be a profound grace to your soul.
That requires an unimaginable level of surrender. But if the inner path requires giving up our own vision and handing over the interpretation of our lives, Chapter 11 forces us to look at the ultimate life or death stakes of doing that. We are moving toward the final separation, the climax of the narrative, and Guyon's profound explanation for the purpose of suffering.
We reach the final plague, the death of the firstborn of Egypt. In the literal narrative, it is a night of sheer devastating catastrophe.
It's awful.
The destroying angel sweeps through the land, and every firstborn in every Egyptian household dies. It is a grim, terrifying chapter.
How does Guyon interpret something so violently catastrophic as an internal spiritual allegory?
She is very specific in her symbolic mapping here. She states that the firstborn of Egypt represent a very specific type of person sinners who have absolutely no capacity to do anything except sin.
No capacity. That implies they are entirely locked in.
It means they are so entirely consumed by their ego, so deeply entrenched in their fake light, and so hardened by their conceit that every single action they take is ultimately rooted in self-preservation and vanity.
So even the good things they do aren't really good.
Right. Even their good deeds are just public relations for their ego. They are structurally incapable of acting from a place of pure, disinterested love. And, critically, Guyon points out that the world deeply reveres these worldly firstborns. Society puts vain trust in them.
Because in a world system built entirely on the ego, the people with the strongest, most ruthless, most calculating egos rise to the very top. They become the CEOs, the kings, the elite influencers, the thought leaders. The worldly system looks at these people and says, these are our best and brightest, these are the winners, these are our firstborns. We worship them because they have mastered the rules of the fake light.
Exactly. They are the apex predators of the ego ecosystem.
That's a great phrase.
Guyon contrasts this worldly hierarchy with the firstborn of God. And she defines the firstborn of God simply as those who are actively walking the inner path, the ones who are entirely dead to self, the pure panes of glass.
So what we actually have here are two completely incompatible systems of existence sharing the exact same space. The ego-driven system of Egypt and the ego-dead system of the inner path. And that proximity inevitably leads to a cosmic existential conflict.
It's an unavoidable collision. Guyon states that the sinners, the revered worldly firstborns, desire to completely destroy those on the inner path.
But let's dig into the why of that. Why do they care? If the people on the inner path are just peaceful, dead to their ego, and not competing for wealth or status, why do the powerful worldly people want to destroy them? Why not just ignore them?
Because the very existence of an ego-dead person is an active, terrifying threat to an ego-driven power structure. Think about how power works in the world.
Okay.
Society runs on leverage. I have money, status, or validation. You want those things, so I have power over you. I can manipulate you by threatening your ego.
Right.
But if you encounter someone who is truly dead to self, someone who does not care about money, who cannot be bribed with status, and who is not afraid of public humiliation, you have absolutely zero leverage over them.
You cannot threaten a pure pane of glass. It doesn't flinch.
And that unflinching presence exposes the entire worldly system as a fragile game. The true light exposes the fake light as darkness. The worldly system cannot tolerate the presence of genuine divine truth because it invalidates their entire hierarchy of meaning.
So they lash out.
Yes, the reaction of the worldly firstborns is to try and obliterate the spiritual walker. But Guyon says that the avenging angels, acting by God's power, step in during this final plague. Their purpose is to humble the sinners, to ultimately destroy the system of the ego, and to protect those walking the inner path.
And here's where we hit what I think is the most difficult, tension-filled question in the entire text. Guyon says these people on the inner path are God's intimate friends. They're safely under his shelter. The angels are actively protecting them.
Yes.
And yet, almost in the same breath, she explicitly writes that God allows them to be mistreated by carnal, worldly people. If they are protected, if they are the intimate friends of the divine, why on earth is this mistreatment permitted to happen?
It is the ultimate question of theodicy, isn't it? The problem of pain for anyone pursuing a deeply examined spiritual life. Why do good people suffer?
Exactly.
Guyon gives a highly specific two-part answer regarding why this mistreatment is permitted. She says it happens first to refine their love, and second, to add to their crowns.
Let's unpack the first part. Refining their love. What does that actually look like in practice?
Think about the physical process of metallurgical refinement. You take a piece of precious metal, like gold, and you put it into a blasting furnace.
Right, to melt it down.
The extreme heat causes the metal to melt, and all the dross, the hidden impurities, float to the surface to be burned away. Guyon suggests that even those who are far along the inner path might still harbor microscopic traces of ego.
Like little leftover bits of self.
Yes, they might have tiny, lingering attachments to human validation, a subconscious desire to be recognized for their holiness, or a lingering fear of losing their comfort.
There might still be a few nearly invisible smudges on the glass.
Exactly. So when they are mistreated by the worldly system, when they are mocked, falsely accused, stripped of their worldly standing, or physically imprisoned, as Guyon herself was, that mistreatment acts as the furnace. It burns away the last remnants of self-reliance. It forces the spiritual walker to confront a brutal question. Do I love God only when things are going well? Or do I love God purely for who he is, even when I am being crushed by the world? It refines their love until it is entirely directed at the divine, completely untainted by any transactional desire for earthly reward.
The mistreatment from the world is literally the fire that cleans the glass pane one final time. It's painful, but it's clarifying. And what about the second reason? Adding to their crowns.
That is her metaphor for ultimate spiritual victory. Guyon is drawing a very hard theological line here regarding the nature of the suffering experienced by the inner friends. She vehemently emphasizes that this suffering, this mistreatment from the world, is not God's wrath.
That is a vital distinction to make. It changes the entire emotional texture of the pain.
It changes everything. The worldly firstborns, the ego-driven system, they are struck by the wrath of reality finally collapsing on their illusions. Their suffering is destructive. But the inner friends, even while they are being actively mistreated and crushed by the world, are only receiving God's mercy and care.
Because it's a process of growth.
Right. The mistreatment isn't a punishment for doing something wrong. It's the very mechanism through which their spiritual victory, their crown, is forged and solidified.
The concluding thought of this chapter, and really the overarching thesis of the entire text we've explored today, is about where safety actually resides. Guyon argues that the safety of God's people does not come from being physically removed from the world.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't come from a magical force field that prevents people from being cruel to them. Their ultimate safety comes from the fact that they entrust themselves to God's shadow infinitely more than the carnal, worldly people ever could.
They find their impenetrable security in total surrender. The worldly person tries to build a fortress out of their ego, their wealth, their titles, and their reputation.
But those walls are fragile.
As we've seen, those walls are made of sand. A market crash, a scandal, or a microscopic virus can tear that fortress down in a day. The person on the inner path looks at that fortress, abandons it entirely, and just steps into the shadow of the divine. They are safe not because they have built impenetrable walls around themselves, but because they have surrendered so completely that they have nothing left to lose.
You cannot take anything from a person who has already given everything away.
Exactly.
Let's zoom out and recap the sheer magnitude of this journey we've just taken. We started with the mission of mapping out the inner path through the Exodus narrative, and what a challenging, disruptive, ego-shattering map it turned out to be.
It is a complete inversion of how we normally operate as human beings. It demands that we look at our primary instincts, pride, self-defense, logic, and recognize them as the very things holding us captive.
We saw in Chapter 7 that the absolute prerequisite for this journey is the total death of the ego, becoming that perfectly clear, smudge-free glass pane with no self-interest, no ontology of pride left to cast a shadow.
Right. And then the parasite.
Yeah, in Chapter 8, we learned the terrifying psychological reality that living this truth will inevitably harden the hearts of the world around you. And we explored how the world's conceit is actually a parasitic swarm of mental lice that tortures the arrogant with anxiety and paranoia, while the ego-dead live in complete peace because they have no pride for the parasite to bite.
We then plunged into the darkness of Chapter 10, which challenged our very grip on reality. Guyon argued that we must abandon the illusion of human reason and sensory perception, recognizing that the fake light we use to navigate our lives registers as terrifying, paralyzing darkness when it is finally exposed to genuine divine truth. We learned the necessity of borrowing God's eyes.
And finally, in Chapter 11, we confronted the ultimate stakes, the necessary death of the worldly, ego-driven system of the firstborns. We saw how the mistreatment we suffer at the hands of the world isn't a sign of God's absence or punishment, but rather a furnace used to burn away our remaining impurities, refine our love, and solidify our ultimate spiritual freedom.
It is an absolute masterclass in the power of internal surrender. And I think, to bring this entire philosophy back to you, the listener, the relevance of Guyon's work is staggering. Whether you view this text as deep theology or you view it through the lens of archetypal psychology and mindfulness, the challenge it issues remains exactly the same.
It really is.
It reaches through the centuries and forces you to look at your own life right now and ask some deeply uncomfortable questions.
It makes you pause and ask, what false light am I relying on today? Am I trusting my own cleverness, my resume, my bank account, or my ability to argue my way out of a corner more than I am trusting what is actually true?
It asks you to forensically examine your own anxieties. When you are lying awake at night, stressed and angry, you have to ask yourself, are the lice of my own conceit, my desperate need to be right, my defensiveness, my secret malice toward the people who disagree with me, are those the very things that are truly robbing me of my peace?
It is always so much easier to blame the external world. We want to point to our boss, the economy, or the political climate and say, that is why I am miserable. But the inner path demands that we stop looking at the map of Egypt and start looking at the internal landscape of our own minds.
Because the internal landscape, the realm of the ego and the soul, is the only place where true, untouchable freedom can actually be won.
Which brings me to one final thought, something I want to leave you with, to mull over long after this deep dive is done. It builds on that incredible paradox we discussed regarding the fake neon lights and the pitch-black darkness of truth. We started this journey by talking about how much we love historical maps. We like to know exactly where we are, geographically and logically.
You like to feel in control.
Exactly. We like our paths to be well lit, our spreadsheets to balance, and our life plans to make perfect rational sense. But the inner path destroys that map. It tells us that sometimes the most profound, transformative truth feels exactly like being completely lost in the dark. So, based on Madame Guyon's radical claim that true divine light often looks and feels to the panicked human mind like having lost all light, here's the question for you to consider. What current period of darkness or confusion in your own life, what specific situation where your logic has completely failed, your ego has been battered, and your human reason cannot find a way out, what if that terrifying darkness is actually just the blinding reality of a deeper truth?
For more spiritual resources, visit lokaken.ai.